He didn't ask about my leg. He didn't ask about the surgery or the pain or the fever that had kept me up 3 nights straight. Daniel walked into my hospital room, set a manila folder on the blanket covering my broken femur, and said the words I never thought I'd hear from the man I married 18 years ago. "I've filed for divorce. I'm taking the house, the SUV too." Then he turned and walked out, leaving the door to swing shut behind him, as if he'd just informed me the mail had arrived. I want to tell you what it feels like to hear that while you're lying in a hospital bed with a titanium rod holding your leg together. It feels like the air leaves the room slower than you'd expect. You wait for the shock to hit like a wave, but it doesn't come all at once. It comes in pieces. First, the sound of his footsteps in the hallway fading. Then the folder on my lap still closed like it was too heavy for either of us to open. Then the quiet hum of the IV machine beside me, indifferent to everything. My name is Laura Bennett. I'm 45 years old, and I've spent the last 22 years of my life in the United States Army. I hold the rank of Major. 3 weeks before that afternoon, I had been on a disaster relief mission in the Gulf Coast, coordinating logistics for a battalion helping evacuate flooded towns when a support beam gave way during a structural collapse at a temporary shelter we were reinforcing. I went down hard. Compound fracture femur and tibia. Surgery, pins, plates, 6 weeks of mandatory recovery according to the surgeon, though privately I suspected it would be longer. Daniel had visited exactly 4 times in those 3 weeks, each visit shorter than the last. He never asked about the surgery, he never asked if I was in pain. What he did ask on his second visit, standing by the window with his arms crossed, was whether my disability pay would be affected and whether that would change things financially. I remember thinking it was an odd question to ask a woman still hooked up to a morphine drip, but I let it go the way I'd let so many things go over the years. Daniel Bennett is 48. He works in sales, mid-level commission-based, and he has spent most of our marriage complaining that my military salary was modest at best. He liked to say things like, "I know the Army takes care of you, but let's be honest, it's not exactly a fortune." He assumed I brought home somewhere around $7,000 a month base pay, nothing more. He said it so often at dinner parties to his brother, even once to my own mother, that I stopped correcting him. It became easier to let him believe what he wanted to believe. What Daniel never asked, and what I never volunteered, was the full picture. Base pay was only one piece. There was the housing allowance, the cost of living adjustment for the years we were stationed in high-cost areas, per diem from extended deployments, hazard pay from 2 combat tours early in my career, and money I had quietly moved into investments year after year, index funds, mostly a modest but steadily growing retirement account. Some bonds I'd picked up during a financial literacy course the Army offered to officers. None of it was hidden exactly. It just wasn't discussed. I've never been someone who needs to announce what she has. I built my future the way I was trained to build anything in the Army, quietly, methodically, without asking for applause. All told, my income had crossed $110,000 a year for the last several years running. Daniel had no idea, not because I lied to him, because he never once thought to ask. Lying in that hospital bed, staring at the closed folder, I thought about all the years I'd absorbed his comments about my modest paycheck with a patient smile. I thought about the times he called himself the one really carrying this family. While I sat there knowing exactly how much of our mortgage, our insurance, our savings had come from a salary he thought was a fraction of what it actually was. I wasn't angry about the money. That's the part people don't understand. I was angry that in 18 years of marriage he had never once been curious enough about my life to ask the right questions. I finally opened the folder. The petition was straightforward, almost insultingly so. He wanted the house. He wanted the SUV, the one I had financed 2 years ago, as a surprise for his birthday. There was a line about equitable distribution that made me almost laugh out loud, alone in that room, IV line taped to my arm. Equitable, as if he had any idea what equity actually meant in our marriage. A nurse came in to check my vitals not long after and asked if everything was all right. I told her I was fine. It wasn't a lie, not really. Something in me had gone very still, very clear, the way it does right before a mission, when all the noise falls away, and you can suddenly see exactly what needs to be done. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone that first hour. I just lay there looking at the ceiling tiles, listening to the machines, and I thought about the man who had just walked out of my hospital room believing he already knew how this story would end. He didn't know about the house. He didn't know about the money I'd put in before we married or the years I'd spent making sure certain accounts stayed exactly the way they needed to stay. He didn't know any of it because he had never asked and I had never told him. For 18 years I let him believe he understood our life together. Lying there with a metal rod in my leg and his divorce papers on my lap, I realized something for the first time with total clarity. The man I married had never actually known me at all. I met Daniel Bennett 14 years before that hospital room at a barbecue thrown by a mutual friend from college. I was a captain then, 4 years into my Army career, home on leave, and out of uniform for once wearing jeans and a borrowed shirt that still smelled like someone else's detergent. Daniel was working retail sales at the time, charming in that easy, talkative way some men have, the kind who can make a stranger laugh within 5 minutes of meeting them. He asked me what I did for a living, and when I told him I was an officer in the Army, he smiled and said, "Steady paycheck, good benefits. Not exactly glamorous, but I respect it." I remember thinking it was a strange thing to say to someone he'd just met, but I liked his laugh, and I liked how he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. That was enough back then to build something on. We married 2 years later. From the very beginning, Daniel treated my career the way you'd treat a government job at the post office. Reliable, unremarkable. He never asked to see a pay stub. He never asked what my rank meant in terms of compensation. He built an entire understanding of our finances around an assumption he made once early in our relationship and never bothered to update. I didn't correct him, and looking back, I think some part of me liked not being defined by a number. I wanted him to love me for who I was, not what I earned. I know now that was its own kind of mistake. I've never been a woman who enjoys talking about money. It's not modesty exactly. It's more that I was raised to believe your bank account is nobody's business but your own. My finances were always transparent in the sense that nothing was illegal or hidden from tax records, but they were separate, structured the way the Army teaches you to structure everything, with contingency plans, with documentation, with an eye toward the long term. The house we bought together 9 years ago was titled in both our names a 2-story colonial in a quiet subdivision outside Fort Campbell that we later kept even after I transferred duty stations, renting it out during the years we lived elsewhere. The SUVA Black Explorer I financed as a gift for Daniel's 46th birthday was almost entirely his to drive, his to maintain, his to enjoy. What Daniel never fully grasped was where the money for all of it actually came from. I paid the majority of our mortgage every single month using a separate account he barely glanced at because he assumed again that it came from some modest joint pool we both contributed to equally. In reality, I was the one covering it month after month, year after year, while quietly building a retirement fund on the side. I invested in a Roth IRA early in my career before we even met. I added to it steadily. I bought government bonds during my first deployment back when I had nothing better to do with combat pay than let it grow. Later, I moved a portion into low-cost index funds, the kind financial advisors recommend to people who want steady, unglamorous growth over decades, rather than quick wins. None of it was flashy. None of it made for interesting dinner conversation. It just worked quietly in the background of our marriage the way I worked. Daniel, meanwhile, spent freely. He leased new cars every few years, always something a little nicer than the one before. He liked eating at restaurants where the bill for two could run past $100 without blinking. He liked buying rounds of drinks for his coworkers after a good sales month, liked being seen as generous as someone who had money to spare. I never made an issue of it. I told myself it was fine, that a marriage isn't a ledger, that as long as the bills were paid, it didn't matter who paid what percentage. I see now how much I was willing to overlook in the name of keeping the peace. I picked my battles, and money was rarely one I chose to fight. After Daniel left my hospital room that afternoon, folder still sitting closed on my lap, I didn't call a friend or cry into my pillow the way people probably expect. I called Robert Ainsley, a JAG attorney I'd known for almost 15 years, ever since he handled a housing dispute for me back when I was stationed in Georgia. Robert had a voice like gravel, and the patience of a man who had heard every excuse a spouse could invent. I told him what happened. I told him about the papers, about the house, about the SUV, about 18 years of Daniel assuming I made a fraction of what I actually did. Robert was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he asked me one question, plain and direct, the way he always spoke. "Laura, do you want to keep being generous, or do you want to protect what's yours?" I looked at the ceiling tiles again, the same water stain in the corner I'd been staring at for 3 weeks. And I thought about every time I'd smiled and let a comment slide, every time I'd quietly covered a bill without mentioning it, every time I'd let Daniel believe a story about our life that simply wasn't true. "No," I told Robert, "I'm done being generous." He didn't ask me to explain further. He just said he'd start pulling records the next morning, everything from the mortgage payments to the retirement statements to the original title work on the house. All of it dating back to before Daniel and I had even married. I hung up the phone and lay back against the pillow, and for the first time since the folder landed on my lap, I felt something other than shock. It was quieter than anger, steadier. It felt like the calm that settles over you right before you execute a plan you've already rehearsed 100 times in your head, even if you never expected to need it. Daniel thought he knew the story of our marriage. He was about to find out how much of it he'd gotten wrong. By the time I was discharged to outpatient care 3 days after that hospital visit, Daniel had already moved his things into a rental condo across town, the one belonging to a woman named Melissa Ortiz, 34, a hygienist at a dental office where Daniel had been going for the past year. I found out about Melissa the way I found out most things about Daniel by then secondhand through a mutual acquaintance who assumed I already knew. Apparently, I was the only one who hadn't. Melissa believed the story Daniel had been telling her for months, that his marriage was already over in every way that mattered, that the house would be his once the paperwork went through, that the SUV fully paid off in his mind would be his too, that there was a solid nest egg somewhere behind all of it enough to cover a fresh start for the two of them. She had, according to my sister-in-law, already started picking out paint swatches for what she assumed would become their house. Sage green for the kitchen, a deep navy for the guest bedroom. She'd mentioned it to a co-worker who mentioned it to my sister-in-law's hairdresser who mentioned it to my sister-in-law, who called me the next morning sounding like she didn't know whether to laugh or cry on my behalf. Daniel, for his part, seemed to be enjoying himself. He posted a photo on social media of himself and Melissa at a rooftop restaurant downtown, captioned something about new beginnings with a sunset emoji. Friends who hadn't spoken to me in years started liking it the way people do when they only have half the story and assume the visible half is the whole truth. I saw the post because someone sent me a screenshot, not because I was checking. I hadn't looked at his profile once since he walked out of my hospital room. I didn't need to see it to know exactly the kind of narrative he was building for himself, the reasonable man finally free of a marriage that had quietly worn him down. While Daniel was busy being the hero of his own story, I was doing something far less glamorous. I was healing slowly with a walker and then a cane, going to physical therapy 3 times a week, and in the hours between appointments I was working with Robert to build a complete financial picture of our marriage. It's remarkable what surfaces when someone with legal training starts pulling threads. Robert's paralegal requested full records from our joint accounts, our mortgage servicer, the title company that had handled the house closing 9 years earlier, and the financing paperwork on the SUV. What came back over those 2 weeks told a story Daniel had clearly never bothered to read for himself. He had, in the 6 weeks since my accident, withdrawn a little over $11,000 from a joint checking account, most of it in the days right after he filed for divorce without informing me. He'd also quietly listed our sailboat, an old but well-maintained 22-footer we kept at a marina an hour from the house, on a boat-selling website, apparently hoping to convert it to cash before anything could be frozen. He hadn't sold it yet, but the listing was there, dated 3 days after his hospital visit, the price set noticeably below market value, the kind of number you set when you want something gone fast. There was more. Robert's paralegal found 2 credit cards in Daniel's name that I had never known existed, both carrying balances totaling close to $18,000, both opened within the last 2 years. Purchases on them included a leased BMW he'd apparently returned early after defaulting jewelry I never received, and a weekend trip to a resort in the Florida Keys that I now understood from the dates had happened while he told me he was on a work trip to Ohio. But the detail that mattered most, the one Robert circled twice on the printout he brought to my kitchen table, was the house itself. 9 years earlier, when we bought it, I had come into the marriage with savings from my first deployment bonuses and combat pay money that predated Daniel entirely. That money made up nearly 40% of our down payment, all of it traceable through bank statements Robert's team had pulled from records going back over a decade. Beyond the down payment, mortgage statements showed that for 8 of the 9 years we'd owned the house, the vast majority of the monthly payment had come from an account solely in my name, funded by my military pay, an account Daniel had never once asked to see. The house, under state law and given this paper trail, was very likely not simply joint marital property to be split 50-50 the way Daniel assumed. Neither was the retirement account I'd built almost entirely before we married, and continued funding largely on my own afterward. Robert explained it to me carefully, the way he explains everything in plain, unhurried language. Daniel thinks he's negotiating from a position of strength, Robert said, tapping the folder of documents on my kitchen table. He doesn't understand that the board is set up entirely differently than he believes it is. I sat there looking at the papers at the boat, listing at the credit card statements at Daniel's smiling photo from the rooftop restaurant that my sister-in-law had shown me the week before, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter and more grounded than that. For weeks, Daniel had been telling himself a story about a wife too slow, too injured, too distracted by physical therapy to notice what was happening around her. He had built his entire celebration, his entire new beginning with Melissa, on the assumption that I would simply sign whatever he put in front of me. Robert closed the folder and looked at me with something close to a smile. "He thinks he's already won," Robert said. "He hasn't even seen the board yet." I was released from the hospital on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Daniel had received the first formal response from Robert's office, a letter he almost certainly expected to be a routine acknowledgement of his divorce filing, maybe a counter request for mediation. Something soft and easily managed. That is not what he got. I wasn't there when he opened it, but Melissa's coworker later told my sister-in-law, who told me that Daniel had come into the dental office that Thursday afternoon, looking pale, asking to step outside to take a call. I imagine him standing in that parking lot, the letter still in his hand, reading the same paragraph over and over the way people do when the words refuse to rearrange themselves into something less alarming. The letter itself was carefully worded, nothing dramatic, no accusations laid bare, just facts, stated plainly the way legal documents tend to state things. It noted that a significant portion of the marital home had been purchased and maintained using funds that predated the marriage and funds solely attributable to my income. It noted that certain accounts Daniel believed to be shared were in fact held solely in my name. It requested a formal accounting of the recent withdrawals from our joint checking account, the boat listing, and the 2 credit cards he apparently hadn't realized would surface. And it noted almost as an afterthought at the bottom that, given the timing and nature of these transactions, the matter might need to be reviewed for what the letter called dissipation of marital assets, a phrase that means in plain English that a judge does not look kindly on a spouse who tries to quietly drain accounts and sell property the moment divorce papers get filed. By Friday morning, the practical consequences had already started catching up to him. He'd apparently gone to the bank to move forward on a plan to refinance the house solely in his name, something his own lawyer must have advised as a way to lock down the property before things got complicated. The loan officer, following standard procedure once she saw an active divorce filing attached to a jointly titled property, told him the refinance request would need to be paused, pending the resolution of the title dispute Robert's office had already flagged with the county records office. Daniel hadn't known there was a title dispute. He learned about it standing at a bank counter. The SUV proved even more immediately painful. Daniel had apparently lined up a buyer for it privately, a co-worker's cousin, who was willing to pay just under market value for a quick no-questions-asked sale, cash in hand within the week. The sale fell through on Friday afternoon when the buyer's own lender, running a standard lien check, discovered that the vehicle's title carried a hold related to pending litigation. Robert's office had filed the request the same day as the letter. Daniel found out about that one through a terse text message from the co-worker's cousin, who apparently wanted no further part of whatever was happening. I heard about all of this the way I heard about most of Daniel's unraveling that week, through the strange, half-embarrassed grapevine of people who used to be our shared friends, and now didn't quite know which side they were supposed to be on. I wasn't gloating, and I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to make this sound like some kind of victory lap. It didn't feel like one. It felt more like watching a slow-motion collision you'd tried to warn someone about for years, knowing they'd never once considered you might actually know what you were talking about. Melissa, according to the same chain of secondhand information, had started asking questions of her own by that Friday evening. She'd been planning around a house and a paid-off SUV and some vague notion of Daniel's financial stability, and now none of those things looked as solid as they had 2 weeks earlier. I don't know exactly what was said between them, but I know that by the weekend the tone of Daniel's social media had shifted. The rooftop dinner photo was still up, but there were no new posts after it. No more sunset captions about new beginnings. Daniel called his own attorney that Friday night a general practice lawyer named Curtis Feldman, who, according to Robert, mostly handled contract disputes and the occasional straightforward uncontested divorce, not the kind of case that came with premarital asset tracing and dissipation claims. Feldman apparently spent close to an hour on the phone with Daniel, walking him through what the letter actually meant in practical terms, that the house might not simply be splittable 50-50, that the retirement accounts he'd assumed were joint were very likely mine alone under the law, that withdrawing $11,000 from a joint account and quietly listing a boat for sale right after filing for divorce was, in the driest possible legal language, a very bad look in front of a judge. I picture that conversation sometimes, though I obviously wasn't on the call. I picture Daniel sitting in Melissa's condo phone pressed to his ear, staring at the same lease agreement or moving boxes or whatever else had already started accumulating around him, in anticipation of a life he assumed was already secured. I picture the exact moment the confidence started to drain out of his voice. The same confidence he'd carried into my hospital room 5 days earlier, when he set that folder down on my blanket like he was handing me an eviction notice rather than the end of an 18-year marriage. By Sunday night, I hadn't heard a single word from him. Not a call, not a text. Nothing since he'd walked out of that hospital room 5 days earlier, believing the outcome was already decided. I was sitting on my back porch with my leg propped up on a cushion, going over physical therapy exercises Robert had printed out for me alongside the legal paperwork when my phone finally rang. I looked at the screen and saw his name for the first time since the hospital. I let it ring twice before I picked it up. I answered on the third ring, not because I needed the extra time to compose myself, but because some part of me wanted him to sit with the silence for just a moment longer, the way I'd been sitting with silence from him for the better part of 3 weeks. Laura. His voice sounded different than it had in that hospital room 5 days earlier. Smaller, somehow stripped of the certainty that had let him drop divorce papers on my blanket, like he was closing out a business deal. Can we talk? I didn't say anything right away. I looked out at the backyard at the fence Daniel had promised to repair 2 summers ago, and never got around to at the grass I'd been paying a service to mow, because neither of us had time, though I suspected now I was the only one who'd ever actually paid for it. "I'm listening," I said. He exhaled long and unsteady, the kind of breath that comes right before someone admits something they've been avoiding. "My lawyer called me tonight. He explained some things about the house, about the accounts." A pause. "About the boat." "I know," I said, because I did, and because I wasn't going to make this easier by pretending otherwise. "Laura." I didn't understand any of this. I swear to you, I had no idea the house wasn't just ours. Equally. I didn't know about the down payment, about how much you'd been putting toward the mortgage. I thought... He stopped himself. "I thought we were splitting things fairly." "You thought a lot of things," I said, keeping my voice level, not cold. Just level the way I'd learned to speak in briefings when the facts needed to stand on their own without any help from my tone. "You thought I made $7,000 a month. You thought the house was some kind of even split you were entitled to walk away with. You thought I'd sign whatever you put in front of me because I was lying in a hospital bed and too tired to fight. He didn't argue with any of it. That surprised me more than anything else in the conversation. The old Daniel would have pushed back, found some angle, some way to make it about my tone or my attitude instead of the facts on the table. This Daniel just went quiet for a moment before he said, "The bank froze the refinance. The guy buying the SUV backed out. Curtis says if this goes in front of a judge, I could end up with almost nothing. Not the house, not the retirement money, maybe not even the SUV since apparently you financed it." "That sounds like something you should discuss with Curtis," I said. "Melissa left," he said abruptly, like the words had been sitting behind his teeth for the last hour and finally broke loose on their own. "She went back to her mother's this afternoon. She said I lied to her about what I actually had. She said she felt stupid for believing me. I felt something at that, though it wasn't the satisfaction I might have expected a few weeks earlier, back when the wound was still fresh from watching him celebrate a future built on assumptions I knew to be wrong. Mostly what I felt was tired. Tired in the way you get after a long deployment when the adrenaline that carried you through finally drains out, and what's left is just exhaustion and a strange hollow clarity. "Laura," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on my name, "maybe we should call off the divorce. Talk this through. I think I made a mistake." I looked down at my leg, still healing, still a reminder of exactly where I'd been when he decided our marriage was over. I thought about the folder on my hospital blanket, about the words he'd used, the flatness in his voice when he told me he was taking the house and the SUV, not a hint of hesitation, not a single question about how I was doing or whether I'd survive the surgery. I thought about 18 years of comments about my modest paycheck delivered at dinner parties, and to his brother. And once, unforgivably, to my own mother, always with that same faint condescension, like he was being generous by staying with a woman who couldn't really contribute. "You're the one who brought the papers to the hospital, Daniel," I said quietly. "You didn't ask me how I was doing. You didn't ask about the surgery. You put a folder on my blanket and told me what you were taking. I didn't file for divorce. You did." Silence stretched across the line long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "I know," he finally said. "I know I did that. I panicked. I thought—" He stopped again, and this time I didn't fill the silence for him. "I don't know what I thought. I thought I had more control over the situation than I did." "You didn't think about me at all," I said, and I meant it not as an accusation exactly, but as the plainest fact of the entire conversation, the one true thing underneath everything else we'd said. "That's the part you still don't seem to understand. This was never about the house or the money for me, Daniel. It was about the fact that you brought me divorce papers instead of flowers. You brought a folder instead of asking if I was in pain." He didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't really expected him to. "I have to go," I told him. And I meant it gently, not as a punishment, just as the truth. There wasn't anything left in that conversation that needed to happen that night. "Talk to Curtis. Figure out what you actually want, but don't call me again until you know what that is." I hung up before he could respond. I sat on the porch for a long while after that, the phone resting face down on my knee, listening to the crickets start up in the yard, as the last of the evening light faded behind the fence he'd never gotten around to fixing. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant either. I just felt like someone who had finally said out loud a truth that had been sitting quietly inside her for 18 years, waiting for the right moment to be spoken. We met 3 weeks later in a small conference room at Robert's office, the kind of room designed to feel neutral and fail at it completely beige walls. A long table, a box of tissues placed a little too deliberately in the center, like someone expected them to be needed. Daniel arrived first, wearing a suit I recognized from our 10th anniversary dinner, his hair freshly cut, the kind of effort a man makes when he wants to look like someone worth reconsidering. Curtis Feldman sat beside him, a thin folder in front of him that looked almost apologetic next to the thick binder Robert had assembled over the past month. I walked in using a cane now instead of a walker, my leg healing steadily, and I noticed Daniel's eyes flick toward it before he caught himself and looked away. It was the first time since the hospital that I'd seen something that might have been guilt cross his face quick and involuntary, gone before he could decide what to do with it. "Laura," he said, standing briefly before Curtis put a hand on his arm, a small signal to sit back down and let the lawyers lead. He sat. I settled into the chair across from him, Robert beside me, and for a moment nobody spoke. The air conditioning hummed somewhere behind the wall. Daniel started before either lawyer could, which I understood later was probably against Curtis's advice. "I want to say I'm sorry," he said, looking at me directly, which was more than he'd managed in that hospital room 5 days after my surgery. "For how I handled things. I was under a lot of pressure at work. Sales had been down for 2 quarters, and I think I was having some kind of midlife crisis, if I'm honest. None of that excuses what I did. I know that." I let him finish. I'd learned a long time ago in briefings and in negotiations far more consequential than this one, that the person who fills silence first often reveals more than the person who waits. Daniel filled it several more times that morning, offering explanations that shifted slightly each time: pressure at work, a sense that he'd lost himself somewhere in his 40s, a genuine if late realization that he'd misjudged nearly everything about our marriage. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finally ran out of things to say, I nodded to Robert, who slid a thick manila folder across the table. Not the folder Daniel had brought to my hospital bed. A different one containing 18 years of mortgage statements, retirement contributions, credit card records, and the boat listing dated 3 days after he'd filed for divorce. "I want you to actually look at it this time," I said. "Not skim it. Look at it." Daniel opened the folder slowly. Curtis leaned over to review it alongside him, though I suspected from his expression that he'd already seen most of it in the weeks prior. Daniel's hands moved through the pages, mortgage statement after mortgage statement, 8 years of records showing payments drawn from an account he'd never once asked to see the balance of. He stopped on a page showing the down payment breakdown from 9 years earlier, my combat pay, and deployment bonuses, accounting for a sum larger than anything he had personally contributed at the time. "I didn't know it was this much," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone in the room. "I didn't know you'd paid for almost all of it." "You never asked," I said, not cruelly, just as a fact, the same way I'd said it on the phone weeks earlier. "In 18 years, Daniel, you never once asked to see a bank statement. You never asked what my rank actually meant in terms of pay. You built an entire version of our marriage in your head and never checked it against reality, not even once." He kept turning pages. The insurance payments, all from my account. The home repairs after the roof was damaged in a storm 4 years back, paid in full by me while he told his brother he'd handled it. The SUV loan financed entirely under my name, and credit, the one he'd told the buyer's cousin, was basically paid off, when in fact I'd been the one making every single payment. "I thought I understood our life," Daniel said, and for the first time his voice actually broke, not performatively, not the way it had on the phone when he was trying to win something back, but in a way that sounded like a man confronting something true for the first time. "I built this whole story about being the one who carried us. I told people that. I believed it. I didn't respond to that right away. I thought about all the times I'd let him say it at dinner parties and family gatherings, and how much easier it had felt in the moment to just let the comment pass than to correct him in front of an audience. I understood sitting in that conference room that my silence over the years hadn't protected our marriage. It had just delayed this exact moment by nearly 2 decades. Curtis finally spoke, redirecting the conversation toward the practical matters at hand. The terms Robert's office had drafted the division that reflected what the documentation actually supported, rather than what Daniel had originally assumed he was entitled to. Daniel agreed to most of it without argument, something Curtis later told Robert he hadn't expected, given how confidently his client had walked in believing he held the stronger position. I found out 2 days later through the same tangled grapevine that had informed me of everything else that Melissa had asked Daniel directly after the mediation exactly how much he was actually walking away with. When he told her the truth, not the story he'd been telling her for months about a paid-off SUV and a house he'd inherit outright, but the real number considerably smaller and complicated by debt he hadn't disclosed. She didn't yell or make a scene, according to the coworker who eventually told my sister-in-law. She simply told him she needed time to think, and then she didn't come back. Daniel called me once more that week, not to reopen the conversation about reconciliation, but just to ask quietly whether I thought he was a bad person. I told him I didn't think that was a question I could answer for him, that it wasn't really about being a bad person at all. It was about spending 18 years assuming you knew someone completely without ever once being curious enough to actually find out. The divorce was finalized on a gray Tuesday morning in late autumn, 5 months after Daniel first set that folder down on my hospital blanket. I remember driving home from the courthouse alone, my leg fully healed. By then, no more cane, just the faint ache that shows up sometimes when the weather turns cold, a reminder I've come to accept rather than resent. The settlement reflected what the documentation had always shown long before either of us sat across from each other in that conference room. I kept the retirement accounts that had been built almost entirely from my own service, my own deployments, my own years of quiet, unglamorous saving. The house sold 3 months later, and per the agreement, I received the portion that matched what I had actually put into it, verified down to the dollar by records neither of us could argue with anymore. I used part of the proceeds to help fund a down payment on a smaller place near my next duty station, a modest 2-bedroom with a porch big enough for exactly 1 rocking chair, and a view of a tree line that turns gold every October. I'd accepted a new assignment out of state not long after the mediation, a logistics command position I'd actually been offered before the accident, one I'd hesitated to take at the time because Daniel hadn't wanted to relocate. There was a strange kind of freedom in accepting it now in packing boxes for a life that belonged entirely to me in choosing a house, because I liked the light in the kitchen, rather than because it needed to accommodate someone else's preferences. I won't pretend the transition was painless. There were nights, especially early on, when I'd reach for my phone out of habit, forgetting for a moment that there was no one waiting to hear how my day went. Grief doesn't disappear just because the person who caused it also caused the ending, but it got quieter week by week the way most difficult things do if you let them. Daniel, from what I understand through the last remaining threads of our old shared circle, didn't fare nearly as well. He sold the SUV within 2 months of the settlement, at a loss to cover the credit card debt that had finally come due once the divorce forced everything into the open. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment across town, the kind with a parking lot instead of a garage, a detail my sister-in-law mentioned almost gently, like she knew it would land harder than she meant it to. Melissa never came back. I heard she's seeing someone else now, someone who apparently shows her his actual bank statements. I don't know if that detail is true or just the kind of story people tell to make a moral feel complete, but I found myself hoping it was true anyway for her sake. I think about Daniel sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of distant clarity, the way you think about a mission that went wrong because of a decision made too quickly without enough information. He wasn't a monster. I want to be honest about that because it would be simpler to tell this story as one where a cruel man got exactly what he deserved, and there'd be a certain satisfaction in that version. But the truth is messier. Daniel was a man who built an entire understanding of his own marriage on assumptions he never once checked, and when those assumptions collapsed, he lost far more than a house or a car. He lost the version of himself he'd been telling everyone he was for 18 years. The provider, the one carrying the family. That story couldn't survive contact with the truth. Nothing built on incomplete information ever does. One morning in early spring, almost 8 months after the papers first landed on my hospital blanket, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I still hadn't deleted. 4 words, nothing more. I still miss you. I sat with it for a long moment. Coffee cooling in my hands, sunlight coming through the kitchen window at an angle that lit up the dust in the air like something almost beautiful. I thought about all the versions of an answer I could have sent. I thought about 18 years, about the folder on my hospital bed, about a man who never once asked what I actually earned, actually gave, actually carried. I thought about how long I'd stayed quiet and what that silence had cost both of us in the end. I didn't reply. I deleted the message, set the phone face down on the counter, and finished my coffee, looking out at a tree line that wasn't gold anymore, just the pale green of something new starting to come in. Daniel used to say my paycheck was too small to matter. What he never understood was that the real cost of our marriage was never about money at all. It was about a woman who spent years quietly holding everything together, waiting to be truly seen until the day he made it impossible for her to wait any longer. He didn't lose a house. He didn't lose a car. He lost the only person who had ever built a life around him without asking for credit, and by the time he understood what that meant, she had already learned how to build a life around herself instead. I still don't know exactly where this next chapter takes me, but for the first time in a long time, I'm the one writing it. I'd love to know what you think this story says about the marriages we build on assumptions instead of honesty. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We share stories like Laura's every single day, so if this one stayed with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Let's keep walking through these stories together.